I'd like to give today a little introduction to understanding, reading, making sense of Jacques Lacan as a thinker. And I want to start with the most obvious thing, which is the great difficulty of Lacan. And this stems from a lot of things. So it stems not least from the fact that he intentionally tried to be obscure in his writing. So he thought Freud wrote too clearly, he was too easily understood and thus too easily misunderstood. So Lacan thought, you know what, that didn't work, I'm going to go in the other direction. The problem is that has led to just as many, if not more, mystifications about the thought of Lacan. So I think that the idea of writing obscurely as a practice, I think we can say is a failure. So that's one of the things you have to navigate when looking at his work. The other thing is, and that's especially, I should just say, that's especially true of the written work, the écrit. My advice is to never, until you're way, way, way advanced in the understanding of Lacan, open the écrit. So don't buy it, or if you buy it, just have it so it looks nice on your shelf, but do not open it. I would work through every single one of Lacan's seminars. Most of them are published now in French. Most of the ones published in French are published in English, and in other languages, so they're pretty accessible. So that's number one thing. I think the other thing is that even the écrit, which just means writings in French, is not a compendium of his thought. It's just a bunch of articles and essays that he wrote haphazardly. Sometimes someone requested him to write a preface to a book on Sade, and he wrote one of the most famous of the écrits, Kant avec Sade. So they're not written, it's not a systematic book in any way that presents his thought in a systematic way. Another reason why he's hard to get a hold of what the whole project is, right? So those are the couple things. And initially the seminars were very hard to get a hold of. They were a group of intimates of Lacan had those seminars, and then they finally got more widely diffused, especially when the internet came along, and then all of a sudden you could get every single seminar, both in French and in English. So not a bad English translation of every seminar done by an Irish guy, Cormac Gallagher, that you can still obtain to this day, I believe, online. So that was an initial problem. It's no longer a problem. A couple other things that make Lacan hard to get through and get to. I think several of the earlier introductions to Lacan were pretty radically misleading about what his project was. And I think a key date in the change about our understanding of Lacan and what I would call the Great Leap Forward occurred in 1989 when Slavoj Žižek wrote The Sublime Object of Ideology, and Joan Kopchak was working on and published The Orthopsychic Subject, and then that led to her book, Read My Desire. Those two books were absolutely crucial for an advance, not just in the English world, I don't think, but around the world in the understanding of what Lacan was up to and its philosophical importance, which I think had been hitherto radically underestimated. And I want to bring that up in my discussion today. And a couple more things. I think the way in which this essay on the mirror stage got made to stand in for all of Lacan's thought, as if this was his major contribution. The mirror stage, it's not even original to him, first of all. Second of all, it's really not that important in his entire system. In fact, I'm tempted to say it's not important at all. And I'm not sure what its value is, except that it's short and it gives people a little shorthand. Oh, Lacan mirror stage. and it appears in a tons of anthologies and everything. And so I think that was responsible for a big misunderstanding. And then the final thing, and this is one thing I want to focus on today, and really stress, is that his thought underwent, some people say there are these 5 stages of Lacan's thought. I think we can lower it down. I think there are 3 main periods of his thought, and they correspond to certain moments in the publication of this, or not publication, but dissemination of the seminars that he gave on a yearly basis starting in 1953. So that's what I think is the key to understand to why he wasn't understood. And I want to try to put a little corrective on that today. Obviously, this is just a video and we can't go too far into making this correction, but I just want to set my put the compass maybe in the aiming in the right direction. So my view is that Lacan's thought does make sense as a system, but that one must understand the system as a philosophical work and understand where its philosophical roots lie. And I think many early, especially introductions to Lacan's thought, did not try to take into account the philosophical roots of what his project was. And so I think that really had a deleterious effect on the understanding of what Lacan was up to. And so that's what I would like to try to correct as much as possible. So what were the 2? I think there were 2 really significant intellectual moments in Lacan's life that shaped him to become a thinker worth dealing with and making sense of. I think he does. I think he's very hard, but I think he pays off the work that it takes to understand him. And I think that's not true about certain thinkers, right? They're just hard and they don't pay off. And so we just shouldn't spend our time trying to make sense of them, because there are other things to do in life. I think in Lacan's case, that's not true. I think there is a pretty good payoff. And I think the 2 events were, obviously, the first one's obvious, the encounter with the thought of Sigmund Freud. So Lacan was in training to be a psychiatrist, not a psychoanalyst. And then he encounters the work of Freud, and that really shapes him and makes him decide to dedicate himself to becoming a psychoanalyst. And that was a shaping moment in his existence. And his feeling was that the radicality, so this is during Freud's lifetime when he's having this encounter, although they famously never met, although Lacan sent him his thesis on paranoid psychosis, and Freud clearly never read it. So that may have bothered Lacan. He never said it bothered him. But he could have made an effort. When Freud was escaping the Nazis, he came through France, and Lacan could have made an effort to see him because he knew Marie Bonaparte, who was helping Freud escape, but he didn't do that. So he maybe wanted to keep this distance. Who knows? But so they didn't connect, but he saw the way in which he thought Freud's thinking, Freud's philosophy was being distorted by too much of an emphasis on the ego. By that psychoanalysis had become too focused on normalizing patients, like healing their ego, something like that. So he really pushed against that, and so he famously called what he was doing a return. Initially, he called it a return to Freud, and part of that was a return to the radical disruption of the unconscious. So that's what he found really fecund in Freud's thought, this idea of the unconscious and its power over us, and its radical inaccessibility, its other logic, It's a logic that's irreducible to consciousness. That was important to him. Okay, so the other encounter is a little less, the Freud one is obvious. Other encounter is a little less known. Although it's pretty, people talk about it. In the 1930s, for about 6 years, a Russian emigre, a great polyglot, also because he knew German, French, English, Japanese, I think, Alexander Kojev, took over a seminar devoted to Hegel's works, starting with Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And Lacan and numerous other important French intellectuals attended this seminar. But Lacan was really devoted to Kojev, so much so that he once called him my only master. So he really was into what Kojev was teaching about Hegel. And so there was a seminar once a week, and Lacan even arranged a second seminar with only a couple people and Kojev at his house every week. So Lacan was getting double for his money. I don't think he was paying Kojev. I think he was just giving him dinner. So there was a real influence there. And for better or worse, that shaped Lacan's understanding of Hegel and made Lacan interested in Kant and Hegel as thinkers. And I think it's primarily Kojev's impact that led him in this direction. And it allowed Lacan, this incredible Kojev, amazing teacher. He had a very idiosyncratic, I must say, reading of Hegel that shaped the understanding of Hegel for 50 years, probably for the worse, not for the better. But he was an original thinker. So Kojev's idea was bringing together Marx, Heidegger, and Hegel together into an amalgam. Well, that in a way that focused on desire, especially the desire for recognition. That was what was fundamental for Kojev. That's what drove us, was the desire for recognition. And Lacan said, aha, okay, desire, important, desire. And then that becomes, when he puts this through psychoanalytic thinking and the psychoanalytic system, all of a sudden that becomes a way to think about subjectivity. And so he takes Freud's emphasis on the unconscious, brings in Kojev's emphasis on desire's desire for recognition, and then that becomes this idea of the primacy of desire, which is interestingly a word that almost doesn't appear in Freud. So Freud, if anyone's read Freud in German, you know that or even in translation, you know the word desire doesn't appear. The word Wunsch or wish appears all the time, but Lacan basically says, no, when Freud's talking about the unconscious, he's talking about unconscious desire. So that's one way in which Kojev really influences his reading of Freud. And then he also influences him, and this is part of this philosophical background that Lacan adds. I think for many people, when they think of Lacan, they think of imaginary, symbolic, real. These three categories, which are ways of dividing our experience. And I think it's important to see how these categories mirror very much the faculties or agencies that Immanuel Kant hypothesizes in subjectivity. That is, we have a sensibility that receives sense information. We have an understanding that puts it in, it's made up of what he calls categories, concepts, important fundamental concepts that put it in a certain order, like causality. Like we have all these different sense experiences. It's the understanding that makes a causal relationship between them. And then there's reason. And for Kant, reason is these other faculties, sensibility, understanding, they just are what they are. reason is a little suspect, which is why he writes a book called The Critique of Pure Reason, because it tends to go too far and speculate about things it can't know beyond sense experience. So reason is in Kant's terms a name for what's beyond, because it goes too far. So interestingly, you can perhaps already see the way in which imaginary maps nicely onto the sensibility, symbolic onto the understanding, and real, we'll talk about different ways in which it maps onto reason. So what's interesting to me is that Lacan, it gives us a way to understand the relationship between imaginary and symbolic, which I think is really important to get a sense of first. So I've always found this is a very helpful way to think of it, that the symbolic is the place from which you see. Like I have a certain symbolic position, parent, professor, resident of Burlington, Vermont. All these things go into my symbolic position, right? And I that determines to some extent, theorist, okay? That determines the position from which I see, right? So I see, I'm located in that symbolic position but that doesn't determine all that I see. It determines the position from which I see. That's my symbolic, all these different symbolic identities constitute the position from which I see. And then the imaginary is basically what I see. And that's, again, it's sort of akin to Kant's sensibility and understanding distinction. I think very important for understanding what Lacan is doing is seeing that parallel. And then for Lacan, the real, the idea of the real undergoes a pretty radical change in his thought. So early on, he just says, the real is what returns to the same place. So the real is the thing that resists our attempts to change it in the symbolic universe. So it just doesn't, we want to think about the stars differently. They always come back to the same place. So this is an example he gives that in the Aristotelian universe, they would try to change they would change their symbolic system, but the stars always kept returning to the same place. We know, of course, now that the stars are moving very quickly. They just seem like they're returning to the same place. Nonetheless, the point is that for the early Lacan, the real is beyond our reach. So you can see this kind of link with Kantian reason. The other thing that he gets from Kant, so I would say that Lacan is the psychoanalyst who imports Kant, even more than Hegel. I'm going to talk about Hegel in a minute, but imports Kant into psychoanalysis. And I think that's been underappreciated. So he philosophizes psychoanalysis. The other thing that he does is he socializes it. So he much more thinks about psychoanalysis in terms of the social ramifications, interactions than Freud does. I mean, Freud has books, of course, devoted to social questions like Totem and Taboo, Civilization's Discontents, Moses and Monotheism, of course. But it's really Lacan who makes this turn, who foregrounds this turn. And I think one way to think about this is that it clicks, I think, for me when I think of this, is that Freud uses the term castration to describe our lack as subjects, right? What does Lacan do? He uses the term symbolic castration. Right there you see the difference, right? So castration is for Lacan a product not of trauma of whatever that comes about because of how we're sexed or anything like that. We're castrated beings symbolically because we're speaking beings for Lacan. So that immediately introduces the field of of the social order, right? In a way that, okay, it's there in Freud, but it's not quite as foregrounded. So that I think is very important for understanding him. Another, and also a way that he's both making Freud philosophical and making him social. Another step in this direction is the way in which Lacan takes up this term. And it's not a term that Kant invented, but it's a term that Kant really made popular. It's the term subject. And in fact, it's such a term associated with Lacan that when Bruce Fink went to write an introduction to Lacan, he called it the Lacanian subject. So it's just subjectivity, subject, is really, really important in Lacan in a way that it's not in Freud at all. I mean, it is important in Freud, but Freud, the term subject is basically absent in Freud's thinking, and it was basically absent in all philosophers up until Kant. So they would use subject like I'm subject to the rule of somebody else, or they would use subject like the subject of the sentence. What they wouldn't use subject to mean is this speaking being that is self-relating. And I think that's a pretty important development. Obviously for Kant, I think it's incredibly meaningful to understand Kant's philosophy, because all of a sudden then that allows Kant to understand a certain fundamental alienation that goes along with subjectivity. And then Lacan would then take that up too. So subjectivity is you see it throughout Lacan's writing and his work, and it's important to take note of that. And that's an exception to what I'm going to say now. So the term subject basically stays the same throughout Lacan's thinking, although it's a little less present later in the very late period of Lacan. But as I said, there are these three periods, I like to think, three periods of Lacan's thinking, and they basically coincide, not exactly, but to the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. So I would say from Seminar 1 to Seminar 6, then Seminar 7 is this interstitial seminar, starting a new era. And then from Seminar 8 on the transference to Seminar 16, entitled From an Other to the Other. And then Seminar 17 marks the beginning of the final period. It's called the other side, or in French, l'envers. So it could be reverse side, underside, other side of psychoanalysis. And then up through however you want to end, because a lot of people think it's Seminar 25, the moment to conclude, but then there's Topology and Time 26. So there's seminars after that, but he barely speaks at all, and when he does speak, it's only very elliptically. So that's the periodization. One result of that is that, and this is another thing that makes Lacan hard to get a sense of, right? Hard to understand, is that all of his terms changed their meaning during his lifetime. Almost all. So I said subject is the exception that doesn't change. Desire doesn't really change, except it basically drops out at the end. He never talks about subject of desire in the final seminars. But the other thing so let me give you one example. So the term enjoyment or jouissance. There's a little controversy about this term. Several people think we should never translate it at all, or translate it as enjoyment. I'm not one of those people, because I'm against jargon, and I think jouissance is a jargony word, because if you ask the person on the street what jouissance meant, if you're in France, they would know, of course. But if you're in anywhere else in the world, they probably wouldn't know, whereas they would have a sense of enjoyment. So we can make the term enjoyment mean what we want it to mean, and clarify that without resorting to jargon, which I think is always preferable. Okay. But that term becomes increasingly important but it undergoes radical changes. So much so that Lacan's main disciple and editor, Jacques Lacan, wrote an essay and actually first gave a talk called The Six Paradigms of Jouissance. So he really chronicles, and I think he's right, there are 6 different ones, moments in which the definition totally changes. So, and Lacan doesn't say, oh, I'm not talking now about what I used to mean by jouissance or enjoyment. I'm talking about my new definition of enjoyment. He never says that. It takes Malaire to come along and go, there are these 6 paradigms. Okay. So, that's just one example. I'll give you another example. In Seminar 3 on Psychosis, Lacan introduces this idea called the quilting point. I think it's an important, great idea. And then it more or less, there's one little appearance later, 2 little appearances maybe, but it more or less just drops out. So it's in Seminar 3, and then seemingly great, important, gone, right? He makes a distinction between what he calls the name of the Father and the phallus, or the phallic signifier, and then that distinction gets elided later. So all these changes happen. Name of the Father becomes the master signifier. There's just, there are almost so many, it's too hard to even chronicle. I certainly can't in this little short time chronicle them. So again, the key thing is, though, he never says I'm changing my mind about what I was saying. And so that makes it, you have to know, okay, when is he saying this in order to know what he means? I think it's absolutely true. So that's a really crucial thing. So, okay. So the first period I want to talk about a little bit and get an understanding of what he's up to in this period. And I call this first period the Kantian, the most Kantian period. And it lasts from the first seminar up until Seminar 6, which is Desire and Interpretation. The first seminar is on the question of technique, psychoanalytic technique. So this reaches its apogee, I think, in Seminar 2, this emphasis on the symbolic as having primacy. Seminar 2 is on the ego, and he's looking at the relationship between the symbolic and the imaginary, and how we get deceived constantly by the imaginary and miss the functioning of the symbolic, which he wants to remind us of. So it's a little like the Kantian project of saying, look, don't miss the way in which there are these, for Kant, 12 categories. And this is what he lays out in the middle of the Critique of Pure Reason, in the understanding that determine how we structure our sensible perceptions. So you can see it's kind of like this is a Kantian effort in these early seminars. The difference is it's the unconscious that's playing a role in this structuring, whereas for Kant, Kant has no conception of the unconscious. None of the German idealist thinkers that Lacan is referring to have any sense of the unconscious at all. So that's what, and then in the real plays almost no part in these early seminars, except this notion that it returns to the same place. And he'll often refer to the real, and this is something that people invested in Lacan tend to keep on the hush, that he'll often refer to the real in just an ordinary way. Like real is just like what we run up against, right? And that will undergo a real change later, because real becomes something much more complex. And then Seminar 7, the ethics of psychoanalysis, happens. It's probably Lacan's most famous seminar, because he has this very well-known formulation of ethics in which he says the only thing one can be guilty of is having given ground relative to one's desire. And so this, like, don't give ground relative to one's desire becomes And what that means, God only knows, right? Like no one is really exactly, he uses Antigone, who stays true to her desire to bury Polynices up until the point at which it results in her being buried alive herself. That's his example of that. But it's not exactly clear what that entails. So that has occasioned a lot of interpretation. But the thing about this seminar is it's really a hapax. That is, it's just a one-off. It doesn't fit within any of the periods. Although there's a way in which the ethic that he develops, even though Kant says nothing about desire in his ethic, it's still a kind of ethic, a Kantian ethic in the spirit of Kant, I think. So I think Seminar 7 is this culmination of Kantianism that then breaks over Seminar 8 on the transference. Then we have this middle period, and it really comes to a head with Seminar 9 on identification, where Lacan introduces, I think it's a really important seminar, Lacan introduces his concept of the objet A or objet petit A. Those two things mean exactly the same thing, or object A. If people use any of those terms, they just mean the same thing. And it's very important to get an understanding of what this is, because the definition of this doesn't change, but it only starts to exist in Seminar 9. So any reference to a small a prior to Seminar 9 is not a reference to the objet A. That has to be made utterly clear. But what it means is the objet A is something that we perceive as an obstacle, something getting in the way of our object of desire. But it's the obstacle that makes the object of desire desirable, right? So just to take a really simple example, the difficulty of getting through packaging when you get something, that's functioning as an objet A, keeping that object of desire at bay. And then once we break through the packaging, we just throw it. It's just waste. We just throw it away. So there's a real link between the objet A and basically nothing and waste. He often will make this connection between, and in fact, in Seminar 15, which is the psychoanalytic act, which is in this middle period, he goes at great length making the connection between objet A and waste and even feces. So, which he thinks feces is one version of the objet A. So that is the great breakthrough, and it allows us to understand desire as not, in the way that someone like Kojève thought, desire for recognition, but desire for this thing that we can't get, or that is always blocking our access to what we think that we want. So the object of desire is not what drives our desire. What drives our desire is the thing that stands in the way ever so slightly of the object of desire. Like it's the thing slightly marring the perfection of the object, right? Like if I just bought a new book and there's a little crinkle on one page, I think to myself, oh, if I just didn't have that crinkle, this book would be, this would be my favorite book. I would love it. I would treasure it. No, Lacan's lesson is, sorry, that's not how it works. It's the crinkle that makes you think there is this perfect book that exists that then you could really find a true enjoyment with, right? But no, the enjoyment is tied to the crinkle, the little damage that the book has. Same thing with your romantic partner, if you're fortunate enough to have one, right? It's the little defects that make this partner appealing to you. And if you strip away, if you find someone who's absolutely perfect, your desire will be completely evacuated. So that's the great, I think, notion of objet A, and I think it's part of what makes this middle period so fecund for me. And it's also what makes it Hegelian. So this is a turn away from the Kantianism of the early period. There's a focus on the real because the objet A is about this point at which the real intrudes within the symbolic structure and distorts it. So the real becomes not this thing outside as it was earlier, right? It becomes this internal torsion of the symbolic structure, this thing that disturbs us. And as a result, I think or you could say it's the point of contradiction within the symbolic order. And that's, to me, that's where we get the connection to Hegel. And that's why in this period, the change that the real undergoes in the second period is or represents a movement toward Hegel. And objet A, the moment that you get it, you don't have it, right? Like this, there's a joke, I don't know who made it up, I think I did, about Lacan talking to his wife, and she's like, okay, I think I understand your system pretty well, but I don't really get this idea of the objet A. And he goes, well, you have to experience it. I can't just explain it to you. And he goes, so we have to, have sex. And she's like, okay. And, they're married and she presumably likes having sex with him. And they get done. He's like, okay, do you get it now? And she's like, no, but I finally understand your concept of the short session. Okay. So in order to understand this joke, you have to know that the short session was one of Lacan's innovations in psychoanalytic practice. That is, he would stop the session at any point rather than go the usual 50 minutes. So it's just a joke about premature finishing on the part of the man, or on the part of Lacan. So he was a bit of a Lothario, so it's probably not it's very much a joke. It's not really probably true in real life. But I think that the objet A represents Lacan at his most Hegelian and at his most radical, and he himself, and I think original. So he himself said, the objet A is this is in Seminar 21, which is the non-duped air, is how you translate. He said, the objet A is what I've invented. And I think he's right. So I think he gets a lot from Kojève, but the objet A is a move, a qualification of Kojève's conception of desire, and I think very interesting in that way, and also politically incredibly powerful. Many, many thinkers have found in objet A a way to think about politics that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about this third and final, and to me, most lamentable period. I know this is going to be a very controversial statement, because a lot of people really think that, and this makes sense, that a thinker, when they come to the end, they come to their most important, most radical, most developed stage of their thinking. That is not my view about Lacan. I think there's a massive retreat that occurs after I mentioned this seminar 16, from an other. So the first other is big. So from a big other to the other, and that's little to the little other. So the point is that it's you only get to the little other, to the other person, through this big other, the social authority. It's a very interesting idea just in the title alone, I think. But later in that, and the other thing about that seminar, which makes it amazing, is he develops this idea of surplus enjoyment as a way to understand capitalism, and then just leaves it undeveloped. And so it seemed that seminar seems like it's great, I think, but it seems like a little bit of a missed opportunity. And then what happens afterward, I think, is I rue it, actually. He develops in this seminar, the other side of psychoanalysis. He develops this notion of what he calls the four discourses. And so there are four, he comes to think there are four ways of relating to each other within the symbolic order. And he gives, and this is I find a little self-serving, that the best discourse is the analyst discourse, and it avoids somehow the analyst in the position of the master. And I find, okay, sorry, for one thing, Lacan was treated as a master more than maybe any other thinker. So you got to wrestle with that problem, I think. So it's a little bit of him skirting out of something that is a problem he should have probably wrestled with instead. And then the other thing is, I think that it makes this move toward multiplicity. And I find, and this is the Hegelian in me speaking, I find multiplicity is always a way to escape or avoid contradiction, which is so important in the middle period of Lacan's thought. So I see this development of the four discourses as a turn certainly away from Hegel. It seems a much more Kantian way of thinking. And then we'll see the Kantianism really starts to shine in a couple of years later. And that is during Seminar 20, which is entitled Encore, which is about feminine sexuality. But it's the main thing in Seminar 20 is about Lacan develops these, and he started to develop them earlier in Seminar 19, which is called Upir. He starts to develop, or worse, it means, and he develops them fully here, and he tries to understand feminine sexuation and masculine sexuation as a non-relation, right? So each have its own kind of thing, and there's no point of connection between them. And so that's why he'll constantly repeat in this period, there is no sexual relation, there is no sexual relation, or there is a non-relation, right? These are his two ways of formulating it. And okay, but the problem is that he loses any sense of a dialectical connection. So there's just an absolute break between the two, which is very Kantian. And so it's not, I think, coincidental that Joan Kopchak, and probably, I don't think you could ever write a better essay on the formulas of sexuation. It's the last chapter of her book, Read My Desire. It's called Sex and the Euthanasia of Reason. And she links the formulas of sexuation to the Kantian antinomies of pure reason. And so it just fits too well, right? That he's now reasserted his Kantianism, and the fact that Joan Kopchak is herself a Kantian, not a Hegelian thinker, I don't think it's accidental that this would be the seminar that she's really drawn to. And again, it's a mind-bogglingly great essay. And everyone should wish that they wrote something like that. That said, I think it does testify to this return to Kant, which I want to lament. Because I see it as a movement away from this real radical Hegelian middle period. So the point is, at the end, and that's why I stress this non-relation, but there's no longer a signifying chain that holds subjects together. There's no master signifier that they hold in common. And as a result, so 3 years later, Lacan will write or will give a seminar on what he calls the santome, which is just an old spelling of the word symptom. And the santome is a privileged symptom. So I can have a symptom, say, my symptom is I can't speak, and that for psychic reasons, right? Or my symptom is my arm doesn't, sometimes my arm bends back, right? That's Laura Palmer's symptom. But the privileged symptom, the santome, for Lacan can't be interpreted away. Instead, what does it do? It has the effect of holding subjectivity together. So the idea is that I don't have a master signifier holding things together, holding the signifying chain together. I just have my own santome holding me together. And the result of that is that I exist as a kind of island or monad almost in relation to other subjects. And so, and this is why the term subject kind of drops out a little bit. And I feel like that's somewhat lamentable in this later turn. And so I think some of these movements that get really celebrated for discourses, sexuation, santome, I see them all as part of this philosophical retreat from the radicality of the Hegelian objet-centered middle period. So that's what I would say. I have to admit that two thinkers as two friends and thinkers I esteem incredibly, I've mentioned her several times, Joan Kopchak and Alenka Zupancic, have found a lot of really important political power in the formulas of sexuation. So I understand that. And I think I can see that. And especially the feminine side of those formulas. And I think it's worth understanding that for that reason. And another friend of mine, Maury Rudy, found a lot of inspiration in this idea of the santome as something that could be a guiding. But to do that, she had to fiddle around with Lacan's thinking. And the one thing I would say, and so that's where I'll end, I think it's important to know what period of Lacan you're thinking about, focused on, theorizing, right? Because Lacan is basically, and this is how he's different from Hegel, from Kant, even from Marx. I mean, there's maybe a early and a later Marx, but the basic project's the same. I think it's Nietzsche, for instance. There's an earlier and later Nietzsche, but it's basically the same. I think in the case of Lacan, there's a pretty radical break. And I think you have to say, oh, I'm thinking about the early Lacan, I'm thinking about the middle Lacan, or I'm thinking about the late Lacan. And I think it's very dicey. Obviously, you can make your own Frankenstein theory out of Lacan if you want, sure. But if you talk about, say, the quilting point with the santome, well, those two ideas don't exist together in any Lacanian universe, right? It's a kind of it's an amalgamation you're making that Lacan himself doesn't make. And so I would just say, rather than saying Lacan says blah blah blah, just say, okay, I'm going to take these ideas from Lacan and I'm going to mix them up and put them like this. And I think that's obviously fine. People can do whatever they want. But I think I think the one thing I want to get across is it's really important to understand when Lacan said something in order to understand what he said. Okay, I still think he's an incredibly valuable thinker for the reasons I said, for this, the way he socializes psychoanalysis, for the way that he philosophizes psychoanalysis. And I think that has not been matched since.